Okay, Mark, we thought we'd talk a little bit about presidents that I have known or talked about. And I was going to start with Calvin Coolidge, but that's probably a little before you.
Not necessarily. I once followed Alistair Cooke. This is germane to what you're going to do here. Mm-hmm. And it was at an AARP convention. And at one time, I stood out from them, but now I blend very well. Anyway, I followed Alistair Cooke, and he was supposed to finish at 3 o'clock, and then I would go on right at that time, following him for this huge audience. So I get in there about 2:45, and Alistair Cooke is speaking. And he would speak no louder than I'm speaking now in front of 2,000 people. He didn't have much energy at all, and nor did he have to, because he was Alistair Cooke, for heaven's sakes. And he's talking like this. And he's going on and on, he's droning on and on. Now it's 5 to 3, now it's 3, now it's 5 after, now it's 10 after, and he's still talking. Now backstage, the managers of this thing are getting a little bit nervous, and the crowd is starting to squirm a little bit, and I'm nervous because I have to follow this. And he's running very late. And the president of the AARP said, I don't know what to do. I mean, we can't slip him a note. We can't walk. He's Alistair Cooke. You can't drag him off. What are we going to do? We don't know. And he goes on. It's 20 after. And he's still droning on and on. And the president says to me, he says, what I'm really worried about is that his topic today is the American presidents of the 20th century. And he's only up to Woodrow Wilson.
Did he finally end?
Finally.
Yeah.
Finally. And I ran into him. I actually met him. I idolized Alistair Cooke. And we were in Baltimore. It was H.L. Mencken's 100th anniversary. And all the Mencken people come to Baltimore. And there's a room, a private room in the Pratt Library in Baltimore, where they have the original newspaper pieces of Mencken. They open up one day a year, the 100th anniversary, at this musty old library with musty old manuscript, and I might add musty old people going in there. And Cooke spoke. And the next day in the hotel, I'm going out to get a newspaper. I get a newspaper. It's down the street. The desk says there's a grocery store down the street, and they have the newspaper. So I come back, and I walk through the lobby. There's Alistair Cooke. And he's approaching. He recognizes me. What an ego I have. And he comes up to me, and he says to me, where'd you get that newspaper? I said, well, there's a grocery store a block and a half down the street, and they have the New York Times. And by the way, Mr. Cooke, I heard your speech last night, and you were wonderful. And you and I have a little something in common. I don't know if you're familiar with my Mark Russell comedy specials on PBS. You're on PBS, and I'm on PBS. And he said, now, where'd you say that grocery store was?
True story?
True.
Yeah.
And these are good, to keep you in your place.
Yes, indeed. This is great. I'm looking at this weather. It's else, Greg. Make sure he talks about those years, certainly at the Shoreham, where incidents that might have occurred during the course of either a program which might be sort of anecdotal, you can't believe the night at the Shoreham when such and such occurred, or somebody may have interrupted your act, or something like that. And I don't know if she had some certain things that are specific to Mark Russell that we wanted to be sure we captured, but that was sort of the general topic. And then I want to talk a little bit about presidents, and you've inevitably, as we prod a president, you may have a ditty or two or a remembrance of something that is sort of unique to them. So let's do the Shoreham first.
All right. Well, the Shoreham Hotel had two venues for entertainment. One was a big room, kind of a Las Vegas type room called the Blue Room, with big major stars of the time. That would include the Smothers Brothers or Milton Berle. Jack Benny actually performed there one time. And the Supremes and Sammy Davis and huge, huge stars. And then down the hall was where I was in the lounge. I was a lounge lizard. And the hotel wanted them, any loose change the people had left over from the high price Blue Room, they wanted the cab fare, they wanted the babysitter money to be dropped off in the lounge on their way out. So I had my shows timed, the last one beginning after the big one had ended. And it was cheap too. It was no cover, no minimum. Which meant that that was the place to get a drink, whether you wanted to hear a show or not, whether you wanted to hear this loudmouth guy at the piano or not. And so at the beginning, not everybody was in there to hang on every word. They couldn't care less. They just were in there to get a drink. And so I had to sometimes shout them down. I had to, it wasn't a formal show as such. A lot of them thought I was just the piano player. Some of them actually got up to dance while I was doing a satirical song, see? Then you'd have the other people who did want to hear what I was saying, and then they would get mad at the ones who weren't paying attention, and fights would break out, and all of that. It was very tough to work some nights. We would have these conventions. One time we had a convention of football coaches. They not only weren't listening, they weren't sitting down. They were all standing, talking about football. And I'm up there talking about some stupid piece of legislation that just came out, because the stuff was written just for local DC people. It was an inside pull, and it still is, really. But as I traveled around the country, there were little pockets of people in each little town that would be interested in this stuff. So one night, Walter Cronkite came in, and Walter Cronkite was sitting right in the front, of course. And wow, what a wonderful night, Walter Cronkite. And a man had escaped from St. Elizabeth Hospital, the local mental institution. And somehow he got into the hotel, and something I said triggered him off, and he went berserk. It was a very, very frightening moment, because he was screaming inanities, and he's trying to get to me. He's trying to get to me to do God knows what. And in order to get to me, the way the room was situated, he had to literally climb over Walter Cronkite. Now, at first, everybody thought he was after Cronkite. See? No, he wasn't Cronkite's back was to him. And Walter Cronkite, at this point, his head is in his lap. This guy is climbing over him. Well, by then, the waiters and everybody had pulled this poor fellow off of Cronkite and dragged him outside and called the authorities. And that was the end of that. But Walter Cronkite was imperturbable. He never lost his composure. He just sort of had a half smile. And it's almost as if this frightening, my heart was pumping like crazy. I don't know what to do. And then finally the riot subsided, and he sat up, and you almost expect him to say, well, that's the way it is. The combination of alcohol and political satire can be volatile. And so with these people who were just in there to have a drink and were oblivious of me, but they'd hear, what? Did you hear what he just said about Nixon? Terrible. And that would cause a disturbance, and so to this day when I'm performing, I talk too loudly. I'm probably talking too loudly now, right? The reason I do that is because I was, in my formative years, I had to shout down a lot of noise and a lot of static. And so these are the hazards. Now, later on, as I got to be a little bit well-known, better known, and then the people, well, we don't want to hear him, let's go someplace else. And then I would get the, a better crowd. Now, in the middle of the Watergate era, was a woman named Martha Mitchell. And Martha Mitchell was the wife of Attorney General John Mitchell, who later went to prison for his role in Watergate, I believe perjury, entered into it. The Attorney General goes to prison. See? When Martha Mitchell first arrived with the new cabinet members after the election of '68, she was a fierce partisan. And she had a sharp tongue, and she was one of these arrivals into town, and they come with every administration who don't like Washington, D.C. They don't like what it stands for. You're out to get my husband. You're out to get my president, and we don't like you, and we can't wait to do our time here and go out into the real America out there. We're real people. So she was like that. This was before Watergate, and she was a good fundraiser for the Republicans. And they'd go out, she'd make speeches and just shoot her mouth off about how she hated the Democrats and things like that. Martha would take a drink from now and again, and it reached the point where she would want to get something out there, get a message out there, and she would call reporters in the middle of the night with a scoop, with a story. See, well, this was, the media she hated the media, and yet she knew the phone numbers of Washington Post reporters to drop these little tidbits these little insights she would have at 3 o'clock in the morning, see. Now, the tide is beginning to turn, and the president is in trouble, and they're trying to connect her husband. Now she gets the idea that they're framing her husband, John Mitchell, that John Mitchell is perhaps being set up to take the fall for Richard Nixon. And she becomes an ally now of the Washington Post. And they don't know, now she's a real problem for the White House. And there was a story that went out, and to this day we don't know if it's true, but the story was that some White House people, or some people delegated by the White House, they dragged her off to a motel room somewhere. This is the story she told. By now she's getting a little bit irrational, and that they jabbed her in the rear with a hypodermic needle to calm her down or something. This was the story that got out. So right about that time, Martha Mitchell shows up in my audience. And she's right at the ringside. Walter Cronkite was sitting. And we've got a big convention there. It's a Monday night. It's the first night of the convention. And the people would always, they want a little Washington experience and get the atmosphere, so they'd come and see the show. And the icing on the cake that night, Martha Mitchell, right there. So I'm having a ball, I'm kidding her, and she's laughing. And it's just one of those magic nights. Mm-hmm. And she's with two men, two younger men, and we're going to be interrupted. Oh.
We're now being asked by my wife for some keys. There we go. Isn't that cute?
Yes.
Martha Mitchell.
So Martha Mitchell is sitting with two men who came with a younger men, and they're in there with her, and they're not really smiling so much. They're kind of look like a couple of stiffs who are there with her. After the show, she follows me out to where we went between shows, kind of a, not a green room, actually it was the pantry of the hotel, and my wife and I would sit out there, and when it was crowded and we had friends, we'd invite them out there so we could talk. So Martha follows me out there, and she said, is there any way I can go? I want to get rid of these two men. Now, she was quite agitated at this point. Mm-hmm. And, you know, she was drinking, and I gotta get away from these men. They're trying to kill me. Whoa. So I said, all right, well, sit over here at this table and relax, because this is just employees only. There's an employees only sign on the door. And so sit there. Now the two guys try to get in the door. I'm standing in the door. I'm blocking the door. And they're going, come along, Martha. Come with us. Come on. I said, you shall not pass. I'm like George Wallace at the door to the University of Alabama, you know, and I'm blocking the door. You're not going to come in here. Get out of here. And they're trying to push on the door, and she's screaming. And I said to the band leader, I said, you know, just take her home, or just get. So took her out the back way, and drove her home, I guess. And so to this day, that piano player, the band leader, we had our 75th anniversary of the hotel a few months ago, and I told the audience, I said, this man here saved Martha Mitchell's life, and he can tell you about it. But that was one of the nights I'll never forget.
Jeez. Any sense, were these guys FBI, were they protecting Martha? Was there?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. This was paranoia, or maybe not. Maybe not. As it turned out, Mitchell went to jail. Nixon didn't. It was, and there are a lot of people like that. There was a director of the Environmental Protection Agency, Ann Gorsuch, a name totally forgotten. But she was a cabinet member who hated Washington. They come there, they hate it. First of all, they run for office. They can't wait to go there. They can't wait to go to Washington so they can tell the folks back home how much they hate it. Jimmy Carter at Hamilton Jordan. He was another one. Hamilton Jordan, they make a career out of that. But you know what happens very often? Their guy leaves office. Their president leaves office. They don't all go home. They stick around. They become lobbyists.
Mm-hmm. You found Washington to be terrific for you. I mean, obviously, it gives you a source of information. It's what you live off of. But do you enjoy living there?
Well, yeah, the idea, I milk this to death. Mm-hmm. I really do. I live in Washington, D.C. for the same reason a coal miner lives near the shaft. I know that. And it's true. It is true. But if I sold shoes for a living, if I was a carpenter, I don't know, I'd still enjoy living there. I do like it. My son, my three children were all born in Washington. I tell them, I said, you're Beltway babies, you know. And two of them moved away. And I said, well, how can you leave? Look at this. Look at the Washington Monument. Look at and I really mean that. And I love landing when the plane makes the approach at National Airport. I love having a window seat, looking out at the approach. I love that. It's a corny thing, but I really do. And I describe it as a city of marble buildings containing people who don't have all their marbles.
Well, the foremost authority figure in Washington is always the President of the United States, and also the one that's in the paper all the time. I'm going to start kind of word association here a little bit. And we started with Calvin Coolidge, and you've handled that pretty well.
You know what this reminds me of? Remember the Mel Brooks 2,000-year-old man, right? And they do this with him, right? Carl Reiner, the straight man. Well, you're 2,000 years old. I'm sure you've known all the great presidents, great figures of history. What's your impression of George Washington? And Mel Brooks says, fag. What? Fag. What about Dwight Eisenhower? Fag. What about Ulysses S. Grant? Big fag. Wait a minute. There's never been any hint in history that any of these men were ever homosexuals. And Mel Brooks said, whoa, wow, wow, way, ho, 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 ho. I didn't mean that. I meant fag, F-A-G, Federal Army General. So go ahead, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
No,
Please continue.
Yeah, okay. Literally, your time period would have hit Eisenhower first. I'm assuming. I mean, help me if I'm wrong, but you would have not been in the Truman vintage, would you?
No.
Okay, so Eisenhower.
Fag. Yeah, he was president when I first started doing this. I voted for him, by the way. The first time I ever voted was in 56. 52, I wasn't old enough to vote. It's before they gave the vote to the 18-year-olds. So, and I voted for him in 56, as opposed to voting for Adlai Stevenson, because I was still under the influence of my parents, who were not political. I mean, they were political in the sense that they were Roosevelt people because they were traumatized by the Great Economic Depression. Was Eisenhower, the great general in World War II. And so Stevenson was too complicated a person. I guess it was around, he was probably the first person to be referred to as a pointy-headed intellectual. I think that's about the time that expression, pointy-headed intellectual. Looking back on his career and some of the quotes, I would have voted for him today, you know. But Eisenhower was too easy, general. Great general, World War II. I think his election had something to do with something a little more simple, and that was his nickname, Ike. Populist, folksy, Ike. His campaign slogan, I like Ike, resonated with the people. If he had used his real name, Dwight, wouldn't have worked. I like Dwight. No. Dwight is a waiter in San Francisco. And so the greatest line about Eisenhower, I wish I didn't have to give attribution, but I must, because I'm a person of, well, I'm being taped. That's why and that was Russell Baker of the New York Times, and he said that the White House during the Eisenhower years was the tomb of the well-known soldier. Isn't that wonderful? Because his image was this docile, golf-playing, grandfatherly old gent, and that was Eisenhower. And when he had one of his favorite people in the entertainment world would perform at the White House, Fred Waring. Fred Waring was a very schmaltzy, violin-laden, kind of corny band, orchestra, dance band. Fred Waring, that was Eisenhower. The Kennedys came in, and immediately Pablo Casals, cellist, you know. And so, in addition, they never performed at the White House, but Kennedy is associated with the Rat Pack. Sinatra, Dean, Frank, Sammy.
Did you use that relationship in your routines? You know, like...
Well, when I started, I don't, and getting me to remember jokes from 50 years ago or 40 years ago is tough, because I can't remember them.
Right.
The Kennedys, it was all tep. I look at this stuff, it's like looking at a photograph taken 50 years ago, and you say, whatever possessed me to wear that stupid suit, that tie? And no, I mean, Kennedys were, it was the father, the money from the old man, and swing low, Jack Kennedy, your daddy's gonna carry you home. See, something like that. It was funny then.
With all the tragedy, Jack Kennedy obviously is November of 1963, and then when did Robert Kennedy, for example, become fair game afterwards? Was there a substantial time lapse?
Yeah, there was that old joke. Everybody was telling it. I told it. I don't know, they're flying over the country, and you can help me out on this. In other words, the punchline, he says, jump out of the plane and make these people happy. Why don't you jump out of the plane and make these people happy? And then say to Bobby, Bobby, you jump out of the plane and make everybody happy. And now around Washington, the Republicans would laugh at that, and that's usually it. A joke where the 100% of them are laughing there aren't as many of those. At least there weren't at the time. As you got the Democrats, here's one of the Republicans, here's one of the Democrats. And so I went down to Memphis in the days when I wasn't doing any traveling at all, but for some reason, I forget why I was booked down there to do a show for an event in Memphis, Tennessee called a Cotton Carnival, and it's kind of their own version of a Mardi Gras, and it has to do with the cotton crop, and the cotton's ready, and and they got bales of cotton, and it's a stupid thing, but I went down there for that. And it's a very formal events, tuxedos, and so the first night they said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, we got a guy here from Washington D.C. He's going to come up here and entertain us." And without even getting on stage, as soon as they heard Washington D.C., they all started to boo. Now this was in the Kennedy years, 62, 63. So this was a 3-night engagement. And the second, and I didn't do well at all. Second night, I said to the MC, I said, "Listen, no need telling him where I'm from. It's irrelevant." Yeah. And I said, "Could the band play me on with Dixie?" Right. So the second night, instead of getting booed, I got a standing ovation before I even said a word. And I told that Bobby joke, jump out of the plane, make everybody happy. They loved it. But Bobby was fair game, absolutely, because it was JFK. He made his brother Robert Kennedy the Attorney General, and so JFK now stood for jobs for kinfolks, things like that. And but I just wasn't as vitriolic as I later became without even trying. I was thought to be mean and nasty then, but looking back on it, I was tepid. I pulled my punches not on purpose, but I thought, well, I was too cautious. I can look back, too cautious. Was it because I hadn't put my kids through college yet, or I didn't have the mortgage paid yet? Or, well, that could have something to do with it. I could have got fired if enough of them thought I was too mean. But looking back, it was pretty lame stuff.
But it probably was the life and the times. I mean, today...
The whole country.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to defend myself here.
Yeah.
From
I'm helping you.
the whole, yes, thank you. The whole country was, we were still spinning off of the 50s. 50s weren't that innocent, by the way. If you look, that's another myth. I mean, you had all of this segregation and lynching, and overseas the Suez Crisis. Mm-hmm. Bad stuff. The McCarthy era.
The Jim Crow time, it was. Did you have fun with just juxtaposing what was going on with the George Wallaces, with the Orville Faubuses?
Yeah, I had a connection one time with what was going on in the South, with what was going on in South Africa. And what are the odds one night? There was a man, I thought he was going to come up and strangle me. Was he from Mississippi? No, he was from South Africa. I had a South African heckler. Faubus himself, and I keep apologizing to you for asking you if I have told you this at an earlier time in this interview. The reason I do that is because I am the sum total of my anecdotes. That's it. And so I do have other conversations. You're not getting this stuff exclusively, but they're not all taped, see? But Faubus, in the middle of the, and he was the governor of Arkansas when the Little Rock High School was integrated with 3 or 4 black students, with federal escorts going into Little Rock High School, and those white teenagers are screaming obscenities. There's some ugly photographs. And so in the middle of all of that, Faubus is talking to some northern reporters, New York Times, and one of them said, Governor, what is the secret of your success here in Arkansas? Why do they love you so much? And Faubus said, they love me so much because I got rapport with the people. And they all chuckled and snickered. And he says, I know why you're chuckling. I know the word is rapport. I know that. But down here in Arkansas, if you say rapport, you ain't got report.
I love it. Were you able to make fun of either using language, the Amos and Andy type approach, or was that off limits?
Anytime anybody tells a joke with a black dialect, when a white person tells a joke with a black dialect, that's terrible. Mm-hmm. I never did. Mm-hmm. Those are awful. Those are the kind that people say, hey, here's one you can use, Rastus and so, and the Amos and Andy reference, younger people. This was a radio show that was so popular in the United States. It was on at around 7 o'clock every night on the radio nationwide. And they stopped movies. If you were in a theater and it was 7 o'clock, they would stop the movie and pipe in the Amos and Andy show. And there were 2 black figures who lived in Harlem, Amos and Andy, and they were played by 2 white actors. Andy, well now, howdy, Amos, let me. And to this day, when people lapse into that black dialect, they're doing Amos and Andy. They may not realize it. It was very exaggerated. Now it became a television show. Well, then it was a black cast, and there's a controversy about it because it's verboten now. It's like flying the Confederate flag. Amos and Andy is bad. However, if you look at the old film clips,
If you can find them.
if you can find them, there's an audience of black people laughing at the black actors playing black people. So, yes, it was stereotypical, but it was okay. There was some funny stuff. The other character was the Kingfish, and his wife Sapphire, and Sammy Davis would get up there and he'd imitate. It gets complicated, doesn't it?
It does.
See. If he says, well, if all of the women in Texas was as ugly as your mama, the Lone Ranger gonna be lonely for a long time. You know, that's, those things. But no, it's Richard Pryor would do marvelous, wonderful characters, black characters, but they weren't offensive.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't offensive. Well, you see some white guy with his buddies on the golf course, and he gets into that dialect, that the joke is going to be no good.
Having grown up watching the TV part of it, you know, Holocaust, Kingfish, and Sapphire, and Steppenfetch, and
Yeah.
all that stuff. You try to find a copy of that television, but you can't. CBS has banned it.
Yeah.
You cannot. It's still only on the black market.
It's probably just as well, because you get into these subjects and the phrase politically correct will come up, and so you'll have somebody say, well, we can't even imitate black people anymore. Politically correct was invented as a tool against bigotry. It was oversimplified. It got ridiculous, but that's how that came about. And they used to have a character on the Jack Benny radio show, Mr. Kitzel. And Mr. Kitzel talked with a Middle Eastern accent, a Yiddish accent, a Jewish accent. He was the character. And it wasn't at all stereotypical. He was a hot dog vendor. Stuff is so silly. And he'd say, pickle in the middle with the mustard on top. See, well, that's fine. But then all of a sudden, it became politically incorrect to do something like that. All of a sudden, the Mr. Kitzel character is labeled politically incorrect, just because it was a dialect of any kind. So that's why all of this stuff is hard to find. The Amos and just take it off the shelves. CBS, I tell you the conversation. CBS said, look, let's make it real simple. If these archivists and these historians and these Greg Peterson guys come around and they want a copy of Amos and Andy, don't give it to them. Burn them, get rid of it, and we'll save our attorneys a lot of trouble. Case closed. We don't want to go through this argument anymore. And it's just as well.
And that's just about what's happened.
Yeah.
Lyndon Johnson.
Yes.
But precisely.
My heart's as heavy as a bucket of hog liver tonight. When I hear folk music, when I hear Peter, Paul, and Mary playing, or once in a while, one of the reasons I don't go to mass as often as I used to is because I'd be so distracted at the folk masses. They have and it was good to have the folk masses, so the young people can relate better than some organist playing Bach. See? So you got some kids in the front of the church, and they're playing the folk music, oh, many times, or the folk religious songs. But when I hear that, I think of Vietnam. I think of a peace march. And when I hear Peter, Paul, and Mary, and I hear the voiceover of Lyndon Johnson, we will send no boys to this foreign war. Well, then now we sent the boys to the foreign war. We are sending Robert McNamara over there, and he is talking to the Vietnamese people. And this would go on and on and on. And LBJ, there's a room at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas. And there's a picture of him. I think it's a famous picture where he's leaning over the desk in the Oval Office. The camera, his back is to the camera, and his head is hanging down, and his hands are on the desk. And the caption over the picture is, "What in hell am I going to do?" Okay. Which is on one of the LBJ tapes. He's talking to somebody. What in hell am I going to do? He got himself so deep and so mired. And I got into that, and old LBJ, and he'd go down to the ranch. And he'd go down there with German Chancellor Erhard, and he'd ride him around on the horse and all of that. And I met him when he was vice president at his house. Vice presidents didn't have their own mansion yet. They just lived wherever they wanted to live. And Mrs. Johnson invited me there because her secretary, Liz Carpenter, a dear friend, said, "We need some entertainment for this little dinner party we're having," and I went there. And I later heard this from people like Bob Hope and Johnny Carson. If they would go to the White House and perform in the White House, and the president is sitting in the front row, and he might very well, in the middle of the show, just turn to the person next to him and start carrying on a conversation. And I saw that before they did. I got that when he was vice president, and I'm up there at the piano in the parlor of their home, and I'm jumping around, and Johnson, "Now that thing we were talking about this afternoon, what I want you to do," it was very, very distracting, very distracting. And but Mrs. Johnson invited me back one time for a reception for the wives of ambassadors. Did I? And there's about 30 ambassadors' wives, Germany, Ecuador, Argentina, Poland, Chinese, all over the world, sitting there. And I am at the piano. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing there. And Mrs. Johnson got up there and she says, "Well, welcome, ladies. We have some entertainment this afternoon. This is a young man who's very popular here in Washington. He's very gay." And that's when that word was just on the cusp of meaning something else. And diplomats do not laugh at jokes about the host government. Why? Because they're diplomats. Mrs. Johnson should have known that.
Yep.
But anyway. And then in the middle of this, it was about 20 feet between the piano and the first row of chairs, and their dog, little, oh Lord. The dog a male dog came around and laid down on his back and had an erection. I had to keep on going.
Yep, that's what you can do.
Keep on going. So, what do we do now?
We have a legend as a spectator. You draw him.
Yes.
So, did you get? Was there a set, like the Lyndon Johnson relationship, the Martin Luther King relationship? It's 1968. A whole hell of a lot of things are going on. Assassinations. We got Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination. You're still on your nightly programming at Shoreham. Does this get confusing when some of these black clouds sort of flow over the politics of?
Well, we would close. The hotel would just have no show
Right.
when Martin Luther King was shot, because that was followed by riots.
Right.
As it happened, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, I was on a sabbatical from Washington, doing a television show in Cleveland. Mike Douglas had done this show, and then he was transferred to Philadelphia, and then the show became syndicated, and so they wanted to do it all over again.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to start from scratch with a new guy, and that was me. And this show was a daytime television show, and Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Daily?
Yeah, it was assassinated the day before, and we immediately applied the show to this. And we've got some local people. We got some local. The mayor was black, first African American mayor of a major city. Carl Stokes was mayor. I think we had him on that day, and we had him, and so we went with the show. Which meant, and then when the show was over, the network news continued with this story, obviously. Which meant that the soap operas were preempted.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember there was a telephone operator who, it was her first day at that station. She quit her job that day, her first day. She ran away from the switchboard and ran out of the building because of the abuse, the violent, obscenity-laden abuse that she was taking from angry callers complaining about the fact that the soap operas were not on. Isn't that nice? But those, when President Kennedy was assassinated, I was laid off for about a month, and the shows were canceled, and all of the conventions that had been booked in all of the hotels for the following year were canceled. When Ronald Reagan was shot, I did work that night, and the story took a turn about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when the president was out of danger, and Al Haig said, "I'm in charge." And so that, I did tell you about that, yeah.
But that's a, I guess it's probably difficult to know when to re-engage.
Yeah, my rule now is just go with it anyway. I mean, if a group is, well, I was at Ford's Theater when Desert Storm started, and they thought that first day there were going to be 10,000 casualties. So should we go with it or not? So I don't know if anybody had. I remember reading that David Brenner, who I know, and I think he's a wonderful comedian. He's the only guy in the country. He worked the night of September 11th, 2001, in Las Vegas, and I think the reason was they probably didn't know about it in Las Vegas. It's Las Vegas. They don't pay attention to that stuff.
Richard Nixon, Watergate, so much going on, I don't want to say so quickly, but things unraveled. Was this almost a daily change?
It wasn't really daily. It would go for a couple of weeks and then it would subside.
Right.
And then it would pick up again. And I remember I would watch Johnny Carson, and you watch these late night guys, and you'd see how it was always a case where Carson, for most of the time, was the only one at 11:30. There'd be others, but they wouldn't last very long. Mm-hmm. And so all politicians knew that if you were in the Carson monologue, you were in trouble, because they made the decision that it was safe. They weren't going to do anything that was going to upset anybody. They never really did. To his credit, he was Johnny Carson. That's why he stayed on for 30 years. And so it became safe. I saw, well, at last Carson is talking about this. Nixon's done for. And even though it was a year before, but then Carson would come out another time and say, we're so sick of this thing. We're tired of this. I'm not going to talk about it. And people were sick of it. But as a political satirist in Washington at the time, I mean, I didn't get sick of it. Mm-hmm. Just kept going, and people wanted to hear about it. At least the Democrats did. Right. Republicans would come in to gauge the reaction of the audience. I think the first time I ever met Pat Buchanan, he came in to the Shoreham. Now, he was working in the Nixon White House at the time. Mm-hmm. And the audience it was a Saturday night, and on Saturday night we didn't have any of the out-of-towners. We had all of the political junkies, the Beltway crowd, and Buchanan, and they were a real good audience. And Buchanan came over to me and he says, he wasn't thrilled with this, and he said, is this a typical night in here? I said, no, it's a little slow. I said, a little quiet, but they would come in. Often, White House people would tell me years later that they would come in, sit in the back of the room. Bill Moyers told me that one time. He said, when he was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, he said, I would sneak in the room. He said, I'd hold my hand over him and sit way in the back so he couldn't see me. And I never wasn't aware of it. And then when the guy's out of office, then they come in, they sit down and sit in the front.
Do they want to be recognized? I mean when a celebrity comes in...
No, they don't want to be. They do and they don't. Yeah. They do and they don't. It's an odd thing. I would always say if they were in any trouble, they wouldn't be in the audience in the first place. Or if a senator was in there, and I'd make a big deal, look at there's Senator so-and-so, and we know he's clean, otherwise he wouldn't be here. That kind of stuff. Just gentle. And I would kid them. I wouldn't insult them. I just ribbed them a little bit. Right. Just ribbed them a little bit. What's the expression? We singe, but we don't burn. That's the Gridiron Club's motto. Mm-hmm. We singe, but we don't burn. We just prick. We don't draw any blood. Just a little prick. Sometimes we elect those little pricks, but that's.
Nixon, did you get a sense before he actually resigned there was rumor, of course. Was that part of your conversation on your piano that Nixon, you should resign?
Well, it was a year before he resigned. They came out with a transcript of the White House tapes. First of all, we learned that there was a recording device in the Oval Office. We learned that. And a White House aide, I forget his title, a man named Alexander Butterfield, told the House Judiciary, the Senate Judiciary Committee the year before, there's a recording device in the White House, and the senators were incredulous. What? Do you mean to say? Well, they were faking that because they heard this same testimony the day before in private session. Mm-hmm. But they're just being hammy about it and faking surprise. So then they printed a book this thick with a blue cover, which I still have, the transcript of all of these Nixon tapes and all of these conversations he was having with his aides. And there were funny things in there that's still in our language today. We could do it, but it would be wrong, Nixon saying we could. And I had little tabs marked out in the pages where I would turn, and I have it all underlined. I'd read literally from the book and take it out of context just to make it funnier, which is, we have that license. So, okay, the only problem with that book was that it didn't have the smoking gun. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the smoking gun had been erased, allegedly by his secretary, Rosemary Wood, hence the joke. If Rosemary Woods had been Moses, we'd have only had 6 commandments or something. So, the smoking gun, and they did find the tape, mm-hmm. but it wasn't in the big book. In the tape where Nixon ordered this FBI to stop its investigation, which is obstruction of justice. And they find that out. As soon as they got that, that was just days before the resignation. And so fierce Nixon supporters, partisans, Republican, conservative, changed their mind at the last minute. They had him. Mm-hmm. It's grounds for impeachment. And the committee, just the committee, voted to impeach him. And before the House voted, he resigned. So you could see this coming. It's a long, agonizing, it's a Chinese water torture. It's politically incorrect, Taiwanese water torture. And you knew it was coming. So they said, all right, 8 o'clock tonight, he's going to resign. So I have a party. I throw a party. I had a suite at the hotel. We had a lot of people, Nixon haters, booze, food, and we're going to watch this. And we're in a party mood, and I mean, what a night. I'm doing interviews on the phone from newspapers around the country, what this is like. Now the speech. And he resigns. When the speech was over, did we pop some more champagne? Did we keep on partying, boogieing? No. It was surreal. Everybody put down their glasses, walked out of the room. The party was over, literally and figuratively, because we knew that this was the end of our, as Gerald Ford said, our long national nightmare is over. My long national windfall is over. And I took some time off, but nobody believes me to this day. I actually had a scheduled vacation, not knowing that he was going to resign the night before the vacation was supposed to start. So that gave me time to put together some new stuff. But that was, it was really, the party ended. It was just like throwing a bucket of cold water in everybody's faces. Everybody sobered up. And to me, the more significant speech was the next day. The next day, before he and the family vacated the White House, he spoke to his staff.
Yeah, we have Nixon resigning. We have this iconic view of him taking off into the sunset. Then shortly thereafter, Gerald Ford pardons him.
Yeah.
Well, probably not unexpected, but nevertheless, it was politically political dynamite.
It's one of the reasons Ford was not elected on his own in '76. Mm-hmm. He pardoned Nixon, and the whole idea was, let's get it over with, and otherwise there would have been a long, protracted vote in the House, and then a trial in the Senate like we saw with Bill Clinton. So he got it over with. And years later, when they opened the Ford Library in his hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan, it was a television show. Actually, it was a Bob Hope special in honor of the opening of the Gerald Ford Museum, and I was invited to participate. And Ford's critics and the Democrats used to make fun of him. First of all, they said he played football without a helmet, and the other one, the unfortunate, was that he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. And so I told a reporter in Grand Rapids that it was an honor to be here in honor of a president who could chew gum and pardon crooks at the same time, and that was on the front page of the paper. But what is interesting about that pardon was, and the Democrats were outraged that he did that he pardoned Nixon, and to this day there's that suspicion that there was a deal that he made. And President Ford, and I believe him, denied that there was any kind of a deal. One prominent Democrat who supported the pardon was Tip O'Neill, who later became Speaker of the House. He was Majority Leader of the House at the time. A fierce partisan, proud Democrat. Mm-hmm. But he and Jerry Ford were friends, and he understood it. And Tip O'Neill, in a book written by Jimmy Breslin, who writes about Watergate, with a great title, something about the year they finally got it right or something like that. But he's interviewing Tip O'Neill about the material for the book and everything, and Tip O'Neill agreed with the pardon. And the way Breslin tells his story, and Tip would say, as one Irish Catholic to another, he said, and he referred to the Lord's Prayer, forgive those who trespass against us. And it was on that level, on those religious grounds that Tip O'Neill. Now, O'Neill never told a lot of people this, nor was he called upon to, but he shared that with Jimmy Breslin, and so he rose above all that partisan rancor. Did you? The pardon reference. Well, yeah, we all. I say we. Those of us in the comedic community. Yeah, sure, it's fair game. You pardon this, pardon that, pardon me. The thing about Ford, unfortunately, was the tripping business. And when he had that, a few years later, after the library opened, he had his own humor seminar, and that became an HBO special. And he invited Chevy Chase to come and trip, to do the bits that he used to do on Saturday Night Live, right. Tripping. So Ford had the ability to laugh at himself, and I made the mistake of doing that with Betty Ford in the audience. They invited me out to Vail to do a private party, and so, and I can't capture that, but in the course of this, here's this guy doing this, and this guy does this, and then Jerry Ford does this, and then I trip with this corny trip, and Mrs. Ford is sitting in the front. Now I know her. right? And I could just, she just very quiet, she just went, ugh, like that, just, ugh.
The idea being same old, same old?
Yeah. Oh.